This is the tragedy of a dual death sentence. This is an appeal to the United Nations. My name is Asafo, Chuma Asafo, detained under the colonial name Robert Williams. I was convicted in 1990 of second-degree murder and sentenced to a term of life imprisonment, which in the state of Pennsylvania here in the United States means until I physically expire. Yes, prolonged torture until death. Therefore, it has been aptly termed death by incarceration, or DBI. In fact, more prisoners in the state of Pennsylvania have died within the last 30 years while serving life than those actually condemned to the state's death row and queuing for the lethal injection. A life sentence in the state of Pennsylvania is a de facto state-sanctioned death sentence. And so this would represent just the first of our dual-fanged condemnation to judicial perdition. The second phase could, however, be considered more ominous. At just 19 years of age at the time of my arrest and forced entry into the dark and constricting corridors through which I would embark on this slow march toward death, I never got the chance to exercise one of the most fundamental purposes of being human, which is to procreate. Within the very molecular structure of every cell, germ, species, organism, etc., lies an inherent inclination toward one's own reproduction, or self-preservation, or proliferation, with humans supposedly being the foremost of all, and thus the most valued. It is universally understood that people are essentially the continuation of people. No one can therefore have any kind of future without birthing into existence from their respective loins their future progeny. This is a God-given right, a natural human trajectory ad infinitum. Conversely, to have this process interrupted or completely curtailed represents the end of a people or species. For me, it represents the end of my lineage, an eternal death sentence. And though this second death sentence isn't outlined in the state's legislative body of laws, nor handed down as a part of my sentence in explicit terms, it is in effect no less. Therefore, the second sentence prevails by dint of the first. In an era where sex tapes and other publicly displayed bedroom behavior is increasingly becoming the norm within a culture that broadly regards sexual activity solely as a recreational indulgence to merely satiate one's carnal or physical whims, it being deprived to those incarcerated in almost all of America's prisons is therefore seen as just one of those mundane pleasures that is routinely taken away as a punishment that comes with being exiled to a prison colony. The 4 states that allow conjugal visits, that is New York, Washington, Connecticut, and California, have stringent requirements, some ironically excluding prisoners with long-term sentences, even life sentences. It should, however, be noted that some of these states, unlike Pennsylvania, have parole eligibility for their imprisoned citizens sentenced to life. Before being scaled down to the 4 mentioned, some 17 states once offered conjugal visit programs, a practice that peaked in the mid-1990s. That is, until a sharp shift in the political attitudes of predominantly white lawmakers decided conjugal relations for prisoners no longer jived with the more draconian measures that were coming to shape crime and punishment within the framework of Hillary Clinton's racially loaded, quote-unquote, super predator designation, targeting young black males, and complimenting her husband's infamous 1994 crime bill, which accelerated an immediate rise in prison construction throughout the U.S. to accommodate the influx of the so-called super predators that were being hunted and arrested in droves in virtually every urban quarter. Also, the irony of the Mississippi Department of Corrections ending its conjugal visit programs in 2014 isn't lost to this discussion, since it was the first state in the U.S. to implement such a program. Parchment Penitentiary, a virtual Mississippi slave plantation, provided prostitutes for its black male prisoners to encourage more robust manual labor, to drive the lucrative convict lease system, which arose at the close of the Civil War, and carried forward by the legal expedience of the double-edged 13th Amendment. This links us further further back to a period when white males owned the very bodies of enslaved black men, women, and children, which included a controlled mating process for selective breeding purposes to perpetuate the chattel slave industry. And though cloaked in many different forms and guises today, the power to determine who gets to breed or not still rests largely in the hands of the state as it pertains to others, especially the incarcerated class. And this is just a rough sketch of the context in which the ivory-coated state has usurped the God-given authority to, as a matter of course, deny me my innate human birthright to fulfill one of the most fundamental, essential purposes of my existence. Prisons in North America have long been considered prime breeding grounds for homosexuality among prisoners forced to coexist under duress in such condensed artificial sub-societies, marked in large part by irregular social interactions engineered by the state, where quote-unquote choice in sexual matters is confined to either a nay or yay, conspicuously absent the choice of the opposite gender, notwithstanding, of course, those who willfully espouse same-sex practices. Nowadays, however, the homosexual orientation has expanded outside of its fabled closet and into the main. It has taken political priority in many aspects vis-a-vis the traditional conventions of the heterosexual ethic, an uneven social arrangement that has come to dictate the terms of today's sexual politics, which, by the way, reaches behind the walls of Pennsylvania state prisons, where homosexual inmates are now officially allowed to engage in all manner of intimate relations right out on the prison cell blocks, while heterosexual prisoners are, contrarily, held to a mere tepid hug and a well-monitored kiss from their mates and spouses in the prison's sterile and increasingly inhospitable visiting rooms. For a state that once held anti-sodomy laws before they were rendered unenforceable by a 2003 United States Supreme Court ruling in the Lawrence versus Texas decision, it signals a quantum leap for one group while another continues to suffer one of the cruelest acts of inhumanity. The California Department of Corrections in 2007 established conjugal visits for same-sex couples. Conversely, the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, though it permits its incarcerated to marry, stops short of allowing them to consummate or observe universally recognized marital rights of intimacy in order to maintain the marriage, with zero regard for either party, incarcerated or not, thus a nominal union. And being a straight new African male, still of viable virility, trapped in a system that has been virtually weaponized against my very genetic future, I find it difficult to ignore these glaring genocidal markers that have taken cover behind the catch-all law and order heading. While the United States considers itself the geopolitical solar system around which the rest of the world's politics revolves, many other nations don't subscribe to its backward views on its class and often race-based control over the mating or reproductive privileges of its ever-expanding incarcerated demographic. India's Punjab and Haryana High Court, for instance, ruled in 2015 that the right of married convicts and jail inmates to have conjugal visits or artificial insemination for pregnancy was a basic human right. Canada, Mexico, Denmark, France, Germany, Spain, Russia, Turkey, Pakistan, and many other countries, including African nations, have conjugal visits in consideration for the fundamental humanity of their imprisoned citizens. Israel, however, although a nation that permits conjugal visits, decrees it forbidden for Palestinian prisoners or the ethnic other held in its custody. For example, Israeli national Yigal Amir, who was convicted of assassinating Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, was allowed to impregnate his wife, while convicted Palestinian so-called terrorist Ammar Zibadin was denied outright the same consideration. A biased practice that mirrors that of its U.S. patrons, steeped in its own Black Lives Matter issues that spans the entire socio-political gamut. In this vein, the politics of population control and other foreboding modes of systemic human marginalization rooted in a historic, powerful, powerless dynamic along racial lines offers a sobering view into one of the seldom talked about reasons for the mass incarceration of a particular group of people, and thus a more concentrated form of control over their birth rate. In fact, Dr. Mary Yarwood, in a September 2012 BioNews article, quite plainly pointed out that making calls on who should not become a parent while incarcerated can lead to arguments based upon eugenics principles. End quote.
And it is precisely this kind of bio-austerity concerning confined citizens that has spawned an underground railroad of sperm smuggling that, though unconventional, has garnered support from sympathetic doctors willing to perform artificial insemination procedures to aid prisoners in fulfilling their inherent desire to become parents, despite their judicial banishment from society.
It is worth mentioning that Ammar Zivadin, the Palestinian imprisoned in Israel, is said to have smuggled out his sperm, successfully impregnated his wife. Scores of others have reportedly been successful in this way as well, including the unusual case where Tim Reiser, advisor to United States Senator Patrick Leahy, assisted Gerardo Hernandez of the Miami Five in getting his sperm from federal lockup in Cuba to impregnate his 44-year-old wife, a move purportedly to quell hostilities between the two nations in an effort to restore diplomatic relations. What then could be said of a government in this 21st century that touts itself as the leader of the free world while still adhering to an archaic form of eugenics reminiscent of the haunting edicts issued by King Herod in an old biblical narrative, or the veracity of its resident penologists, who with a straight face justifies low-intensity genocide by cutting off its incarcerated class from their natural human purpose in the name of administering justice. So it is my quest to overturn this violation of my human rights and to gain access to my full humanity, to preserve the life of my future in light of my temporal mortality. Now consider how doubly compounded this tragedy is for women currently under death by incarceration sentences here in the state of Pennsylvania, many whose proverbial biological clock was outpaced by the attrition of how long they spent in prison. One such woman, Avis Lee, comes to mind. She was in prison at just 18 years old and has spent some 40 years in custody without consideration for her biological future. She, among many others similarly situated, epitomizes the grossest violation of human rights. Even more ominous is the life sentence for many convicted of second-degree murder, and it is, according to the law, illegal in the state of Pennsylvania. But just as the Pennsylvania Constitution, Article 5, Section 16 clearly states that the ultimate cutoff age for a juvenile or minor is 21, it still goes ignored by the courts because of its political inconvenience. Damn shame. Prisoners' lives matter.